Hey guys, how's it going? It's nice to be able to talk to you again. Um, some of you have been asking me about this material, about this lesson about marriage and remarriage. And I think it's a very important one because, yeah, we will deal with a lot of people who are divorced, or remarried, or they want to remarry. And I think it's good that we know what to tell them from a biblical perspective. And there are so many opinions about it, so many views, so many extreme views, sometimes very radical views. People that believe that if you are remarried, every time you have sex with your new wife, you are fornicating. People that believe that you should divorce your second husband or wife and try to remarry with the first one, or that you should stay alone forever, or that you can also just marry and remarry as you wish. Um, yeah, the question, what is good in God's eyes? And of course, we can go very theological, and I will go first a little bit in not theology, but just checking what the Bible says in context. Because the problem here is that people pick, there are 4 times the Bible speaks about divorce and marriage, and we need to see all those 4 times in order to get the biblical view of it, because they don't contradict each other at all, but they give a complete solid image of what God wants and how God wants us to deal with this sin of divorce, because it is a sinful act in many ways. So let's get started. First of all, I want to speak about the first perspective, that is about the beginning, how things happened in the very beginning, how God meant it to be. So the first text I want to have here is Genesis, and the man said, "This is now bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. Therefore shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh." So here is the Bible speaking about the original meaning of marriage, how God intended it to be in a perfect world, when there was no relational problems, when there was no sin, no shame, no guilt, no accusations, no lies, no offenses. Perfect place without illness, without anything that we know today. These were perfect people in a perfect place, in a perfect communion with God, in which relationships were perfect. None of this is my assumption. I'm just speaking the biblical truth and just giving a bit of background to this text. And then God creates a woman for the man, and he says that the man should leave his parents, cleave or join his wife, like the sexual union, and they shall be one flesh. Now, careful here, the Bible does not say that if you have had sex with a woman, she is automatically your wife. That's not written anywhere. But in this case, in that context, at that time, a woman was declared someone's wife, and then they had the right to have sex, and they became through sex one flesh. This is just what it says originally, the meaning of marriage for God. God meant relationships, the marriage relationship, to be forever. God didn't mean it to be stopped, interrupted, broken, or destroyed. There's not much more to say about that. But then you know what happens. After that came sin, came guilt. People were put out of the Garden of Eden, and then relational problems began: murder, violence, lies. Yeah, you know, the whole package of sin. Then, yeah, of course, you know, Noah, Abraham, the promise, Israel, and the whole story goes on. People end up in Israel, in Egypt. They leave Egypt, the Exodus, and everything happens, and then God gives the law. Now, what happens here? Why was the law necessary? It was necessary just to show men how sinful and how far they were from God, and to regulate some of the things that had developed through sin. So here we see that the law now brings regulations for divorce. Let's just look at what it says. This is not I don't mean that this should be applied today, but it's just to see what the whole picture, how the Bible puts it all together. First, perfect relationships. Now, fallen relationships, and the laws to control that. Deuteronomy 22, But if this thing is true, here's speaking about a marriage in which the man is accusing the wife of not being a virgin, of having lost her virginity before coming to marriage. And he accuses the woman of that. So then Moses says, if this thing is true, that tokens of virginity have not been found for the girl, then they shall bring out the girl to the door of her father's house, and the men of her city shall stone her with stones, and she shall die. For she has done folly in Israel to commit fornication in her father's house. And you shall put away the evil from among you. If a man is found lying with a woman married to a husband, then they shall both of them die, and the man that lay with the woman, and the woman. And you shall put away the evil from Israel. Now, why do I put this text here? This is not talking about divorce, but this is going to be very important information for the next text. Here, you know that in those times, women were not allowed to marry or divorce. They were, in a way, property of the man. And, you know, it was a custom that when they got married, there should be, you know, a proof of her virginity, namely blood in the sheets of the marital sheets of the bed. And if a man would accuse a woman of not being a virgin, of having fornicated with somebody, and if that was found to be true, she had to be stoned. Or if there had been adultery, if the woman had laid with somebody after being married, the same thing. This gives a little bit of insight to the story of Jesus with the woman that was found in the act of adultery and was brought to Jesus. And it was a strange thing because here we see that both women and men should have been stoned. But they brought only the woman. You know, there was always the Pharisees were trying to trap Jesus. But that's another story. And then we have the next text, just 2 chapters later. You see that we have here Deuteronomy 22, and here we go to 24. When a man has taken a wife and married her, and here comes the divorce, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes, because he has found a thing of uncleanness in her, and he writes her a bill of divorce, and puts it in her hand, and sends her out of his house, and if she goes out from his house and goes and becomes another man's wife, and the latter husband hates her, and writes her a bill of divorce, and puts it in her hand, and sends her out of his house, or if the latter husband who took her to be his wife dies, all of that is the condition, if any of this happens, her former husband, who sent her away, is not to take her again to be his wife, after she is defiled. For it is a hateful thing before Jehovah, or as other translations say it, it is an abomination for God, and you shall not cause the land to sin, which Jehovah your God is given to you as an inheritance. Now look at this text, because this text is the basis for what the Pharisees did or used to do when they talked to Jesus. So it's very important to get this. A man takes a woman, he marries that woman, and he gives her a bill of divorce because of these reasons, as we say in the beginning of the text, that she finds no favor in his eyes. Because of something unclean. Now, many people say that this unclean, they relate it immediately, oh, it must be a sexual thing. But, yeah, okay, what sexual thing can be considered, according to the law of Moses, unclean? What? Most of people think, yeah, if she had had sex, or, yeah, well, sex with somebody else, or before the time. If that was the case, she would have been stoned to death. But here, Moses says, don't stone her, just send her away with a letter of divorce. So, it's a different thing. But what is it then? What is this unclean thing that takes the favor of the husband away from his wife? That's first point, and we're going to check that in a minute. And later, it speaks also about this woman being remarried, and she, as a remarried woman, under not any circumstance could go back to her first husband. Even if her second husband would die, she was not allowed to go back, because it was an abomination. That is not a law, it's something about the character of God. So, Here there are two key points. Please keep them in mind. First, we were speaking about in the beginning how relationships were perfect and meant to be forever, man and woman becoming one flesh through sex. Then we have the law. Once that was broken and destroyed, how the woman needed to prove that she was a virgin and otherwise be stoned to death, and how a woman could have something unclean that took the favor away from her husband that was not sexual, because if it had been a sexual act of impurity, then she would have been stoned. And how she could not go back to her first husband. This was the law. Now, here we have the unclean thing. This is the word unclean in Hebrew. Very clear. Erva. It means nakedness, nudity, shame, or pudenda, that is the intimate parts of a person. Pudenda, implying shameful exposure. Nakedness of a thing, indecency, improper behavior. So we have all these different points. Or exposed and undefended in the figurative sense. So we have here a clear example of this. A clear example of this would be when the spies went into Jericho, or whenever a spy was sent into another country, they were sent in order to found the erva from that nation. That means their weak points, in order to find not their shameful deeds, but their nakedness in a way, like things that would put this nation in vulnerability. So that is the root of this word, translated into the Bible as unclean, which was what took the favor away. So if we would freely translate it in our own way, it would say, when a man has taken a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found a thing of shame in her, something shameful, something weak, or something naked in her. Of course, that would not make sense in context. So it's an unclear meaning. What could that thing be, if we speak practically? And it was so unclear that even the Pharisees in the time of Jesus didn't know what it meant. And there were two views back then, and the names are not important, two different Pharisees who said, one of them said that you could not divorce unless for very serious offenses, and he had his rules for that. And there was another guy who said, no, if anything that can take the favor away, bad cooking, whatever, doesn't speak nice, doesn't smell good, any reason that would take the favor away, then the husband could just send her away, just like that. So the Pharisees, being as smart as they were, for the Israelites it's very important just to keep the rules, and the heart it is not so meaningful. While Jesus was bringing everything back to the heart of people and the heart of God. So what they used to do back then, they would just divorce a wife, taking that the law was saying that something unclean that gives no favor. They would just divorce wife for any reason, and they would send them away, and they would consider that to be very important. The Pharisees had the traditions of the elders, which was for them as important as the law of Moses, which included a whole package of rules that are not found in the Bible. Now, the context is that these guys were rich, and they would divorce as they pleased and remarry as they pleased. So they would divorce, and only rich people could afford divorcing so many times because you had to pay money for it. You can read Deuteronomy a little farther to figure out that law, but that was the case. So they come to Jesus and they try to tempt him, making him speak against the traditions of the elders or the law so that they can stone him. And they are trying to trap him to make him speak against it. So this is the context in the conversation of Jesus with the Pharisees. Based on this conversation is that many churches or teachers assume that any kind of divorce is always adultery, and if you divorce the person you're married with, as long as that person lives, you are in continuous sin if you remarry. So let's check it out. Here is Matthew 19. And the Pharisees came near to him, to Jesus, tempting him. Look at that, tempting him. They were trying to provoke him. And saying to him, is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for every reason? Other translations put it for any reason. And look at the question. Is it lawful? He's speaking about the law, about the rule, if it's okay, for a man to put away his wife, not for a man to divorce. A man to put away his wife. Of course, this means divorce, but not any kind of divorce. A man putting away his wife, which was a reality in the Jewish culture. Wives were property of the man. Wives had no home of themselves, unless they were widows or something like that. I don't know exactly all those little details, but in general, only the man could put away his wife. The wife could not just walk away. The man had to divorce, put a bill of divorce, a letter of divorce in his wife's hands, but not otherwise. So the question is, they were doing this practice, they were following the law, taking that just anything would put away the favor in their eyes was a legal reason to divorce. So they were divorcing and remarrying, technically being promiscuous, having a lot of different wives, but not breaking the law. And then look how Jesus answers. He said to them, have you not read? Jesus many times answers with questions, making people think together with him, bringing them to the logical conclusion instead of just saying his opinion straight on. Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning created them male and female? And he said, for this reason, a man shall leave father and mother and shall be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. He's quoting in the beginning, our first perspective. So that they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no man separate. Okay, so here Jesus is not bringing anything new. He's just reading what it says in Genesis and just telling them, guys, come on, marriage is for life. Why are you trying to break something that God has put together? So here the Pharisees, they think, okay, we got him. We made him speak against the traditions of our elders. And they said to him, why then did Moses command to give a bill of divorce? Pay attention here that they say Moses command. They don't say God command. To give a bill of divorce. And to put her away. Not than just to get divorced, to put her away. This is very important. Who takes the initiative of divorce? Who is the one walking away? Because of course in our days, both men and women can just decide to walk away from each other. He said to them, in view of your hard-heartedness, because they're asking why did Moses allow that? And he said he did it because your hearts are so hard. Because of that, Moses allowed you to put away your wives. Again, put away your wives. But from the beginning, he goes back, it was not so. Now, then you may say, okay, case closed. Divorce is impossible. If it happens, then it's always a sin. In a way it can be, but Jesus is here saying something very clear. In the beginning it was not so. In the beginning people were also walking naked and there was no sin. They were talking about different realities and we are not living in the times as they were in the beginning. So far Jesus is stating and declaring the heart of God. Divorce is not in God's heart and divorce should not happen. But because we have so hard hearts, God allowed Moses to regulate it with these laws. But here comes the beautiful thing. Jesus says, and I say to you. Other translations say, but I say to you. Like here is Jesus saying his opinion, his heart. This is what is going to count from now on. Whoever shall put away his wife. Again, put away. The guilt here goes to the one putting the wife away. Whoever shall put away his wife, if not for fornication, and shall marry another, that one commits adultery. Now this is super important. Now Jesus is explaining here his heart and what he says that counts now. But I say to you that whoever puts away his wife, the person says, you know what, I don't want to live with you anymore, get out of my house, or I leave you. If not for fornication, that means that fornication is a case in which divorce is legal and in which remarrying is legal. Because he's talking here, if you read the end of the sentence about remarrying, then if somebody divorces because of fornication, then remarrying is not adultery. But also important, what is fornication in this text? Fornication is the Greek word porneia, the same root word for porno, pornography, and all those nasty stuff. Fornication, porneia, means any sort of sexual intercourse in which penetration is necessary. This is not speaking about the mental lust, about the looking at women with lust. That's a different Greek word. Fornication, or porneia, that's the real word, implies any sort of sexual penetration with another flesh that is not your wife's or husband's. That can be sex before marriage, sex with married people that are not married to you, or sex with a different person than your spouse, sex with animals, sex with children, sex with homosexual sex. Any sort of penetration that makes you one flesh with any other flesh that is not the flesh of your husband or wife. That is the literal translation of porneia. So if that has happened, you may divorce and you may remarry without committing adultery. That is what the text is saying. If you put away, if you decide to stop, to quit your marriage, the only reason why you could decide that would be because of porneia. In that case, you could remarry without committing adultery. Now, it doesn't mean that you must divorce. God's heart is always for restoration, and it's better to try to heal and restore your marriage rather than break it apart. The pain of finding a new husband or wife, of sharing the paternity with the new husband or wife of your ex-spouse, there's the pain of going through all of that is going to be so much more than the pain of restoring your marriage and forgiving and accepting, of course, depending on many circumstances. But I would always encourage, and I've seen great miracles how God has restored marriages that were broken by adultery and fornication. There is always hope. But if a person decides not to go on, it is allowed in this context by what Jesus is saying here. And he continues, and the one who marries her who was put away commits adultery. Okay, well, nothing to say to that. That's just very clear. And his disciples said to him, if the case of the man be so with his wife, it is not good to marry. Yeah, not a bad conclusion, given the circumstances. But now remember, here is Jesus speaking to Pharisees in a Jewish context. Doesn't mean that this applies only to the Jews, but we need to understand what he's saying. He's speaking about the law of Moses and Moses allowing Jews to put away their wives for certain reasons, but that it was not in God's heart and that was not what God said in the beginning. And he's explaining that only porneia is a legal reason to divorce and that allows people to remarry without been committing fornication. We can imagine here, and this is not a biblical conclusion, but we can assume, that's my assumption at least, that sex, cleaving to your wife, as Genesis brings it, makes you one flesh. And if you have sex with another flesh that is not your wife's, you are breaking that one flesh union. But well, that's another matter. So far, we had in the beginning perfect relationships, lifelong relationships in a perfect world with no sin, in which people were walking around naked and just enjoying a perfect relationship with God that was broken and destroyed by sin. God allowed Moses to give laws. There's the second part, the law that we have read in Deuteronomy. Wives should be stoned to death if they were found to be sexually immoral. But if they lost the favor of their husband through something erva, through something shameful, they were allowed to be sent away to remarry, but not to go back to their first husbands. That's what the law gave. And Jesus explained that the law was given just because of the heart of men, that it was so hard that they just gave a law. God allowed Moses to regulate it with the law. but it was not God's heart. Moses allowed that. And Jesus gives as he did with all the law, put the standard even higher. And he said, sorry guys, that law was the law of Moses, but it's not God's heart. You are not allowed to divorce your wives. Marriage is forever. And if you divorce for unlawful or illegal reasons, then you're committing adultery if you remarry. In that case, and speaking about not just a divorce, it's speaking about people putting away their partner, putting away their spouse. Keep please the eyes in the context of who is saying what and to who and why. Because the question of the Pharisees here was if he was allowed to divorce for any or for every reason. And Jesus says, no, not for every reason, just for one reason. And if you don't divorce for that one reason, you are committing a sin when you remarry. Technically saying you can divorce, but then don't marry again. Okay, we can assume that based on the context. Now, we have another text here, Matthew 5, it says exactly the same thing. Whoever puts away his wife, let him give her a bill of divorce. It was said that by the law, but I say to you, again, but I say to you, whoever puts away his wife apart from a matter of fornication, again, porneia, causes her to commit adultery. And if you check the Greek of this sentence, it's interesting that fornication is porneia, and adultery is, I don't remember the word, but a different Greek word. And whoever shall marry the one put away commits adultery. Now, so far. Another text, Mark 10:2. Now, the Gospel of Mark was written for Gentiles and not for Jews. That's why the law is not so strongly mentioned here. And in this book, speaks that it does mention women leaving their husband too. Coming near, the Pharisees asked him if it is lawful for a man to put away his wife, testing him. No, so far it's the same story. But answering, he said to them, what did Moses command you? And they said, Moses allowed to write a bill of divorce and to put away. And answering, Jesus said to them, with respect to your hard-heartedness, he wrote this command to you. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. Because of this, a man shall leave his father and mother, and shall be joined to his wife, speaking of sexual union, and the two shall be, through this union, one flesh. So that they no longer are two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God yoked together, let no man put apart. So far, it's exactly the same story, nothing different. And again in the house, his disciples asked him about the same, and he said to them, whoever may dismiss his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. Dismiss his wife. Same point. The person that sends the other one away, not the victim of divorce, but the perpetrator of divorce. But nevertheless, even if somebody marries the woman who was sent away, is committing adultery. And if a woman puts away her husband, here this is something not mentioned in the other text. I believe because this gospel was written for Gentiles. And marries another, and she commits adultery. Okay? So far, no contradictions. Everything is on the same pace, on the same line. We just see the heart of God from the beginning, and we see the law trying to regulate it as much as also the law is trying to regulate sin. Of course, sin is as much not in God's heart as much as divorce is not in God's heart. So let's not maximize sins just because of what implications they have in our society. God allowed Moses to regulate it. And then Jesus comes and he says, guys, you cannot divorce just for whatever reason. There's only one reason to divorce. And if you don't divorce for that reason, just divorce is not to be done. You should not put your partner away. Of course, here he's not blaming the one that has been put away. But he's mentioning that if you are one flesh with this man or woman, you are not allowed to remarry, because in that case it's adultery. Good. Now comes Paul. Paul does not contradict any of the things mentioned so far. He expands on it, and he speaks to the Gentiles. Paul and the Gentiles, because he's right. He dealt with Gentiles most of his ministry, with Jews as well. Most of the churches he dealt with were a mixed church between Jews and Gentiles. He began mostly preaching to Jews in foreign nations, and later he tried to be more focused on only the Gentiles in foreign nations. You can read that in Acts 20, when he started, he realized and he says, indeed, I better just go to the Gentiles, because till Acts 20 he was preaching only to the Jews or mainly to the Jews, and if Gentiles got saved, okay, but his focus was still the Jews living in foreign nations. It still took him a while to get the point of his calling. Now, 1 Corinthians 7 is an interesting chapter because 1 Corinthians 7 is dealing with an answer. Paul is answering the Corinthians. They wrote him a letter. We don't have the letter, but you can read in the book of Corinth how that develops. They write him a letter. They send him this letter, and he starts answering to questions that were stated to him. We don't know the questions, but we can understand the questions based on the answers. Now, to have some background before we read this, let's check a little bit what Corinth was, what kind of city that was. There was a harbor, and let's read what it says here. She had a reputation for commercial prosperity, so they were rich, but she was also a byword for evil living. The word Corinthiasestai, that means to live like a Corinthian, had become a part of the Greek language and meant to live with a drunken and immoral, how do you pronounce this word again? Debauchery, which means, a lifestyle, bad lifestyle, immoral lifestyle. So, Aelian, the late Greek writer, tells us that if ever a Corinthian was shown up on the stage in a Greek play, he was shown drunk. So that was the reputation of the Corinthians. They were mainly drunk and immoral. The very name Corinth was a synonymous of debauchery, and there was one source of evil in the city which was known all over the civilized world. Above the isthmus towered the hill of the Acropolis, and on it stood the great temple of Aphrodite, the goddess of love. To the temple there were attached 1,000 priestesses, who were sacred prostitutes, and in the evenings they descended from the Acropolis and plied their trade upon the streets of Corinth until it became a proverb. It is not every man who can afford a journey to Corinth, because of the high level of prostitution. In addition to these cruder sins, there flourished a far more recondite vices, which had come in with the traders and sailors from the ends of the earth, until Corinth became not only a synonym for wealth and luxury, drunkenness and debauchery, but also for filth. So you see, Corinth was an extremely immoral city. A lot of sex, illegal sex, and you see that in the letter of Corinth they were dealing with a man who was having sex with his stepmother. Because those were the kind of things they were dealing with in this church. Now, before we continue with this, let's better check the whole chapter of 1 Corinthians 7. Hold on, let me go to the Bible program. Because it's good. Context always gives us the best explanations of everything. Bit of patience. Now, the first verse of the letter of Corinth, or to the Corinthians, speaks about. Paul begins telling the Corinthians, well, about your question, the thing you asked me about. It is better not to touch a woman. Oh, here we go. There we have, let me see a good translation. Which one is good? Let's check the American Standard Version. Let's make this bigger. And let's go to 1 Corinthians. Where is it? Here's Spanish 7. Let's just give the Bible verse. Now, there we go. Let's make this big. This is big enough. He's now concerning the things whereof you wrote me. Let's put this translation is still too old. A literal translation. Concerning the things of which you wrote to me, good it is for a man not to touch a woman. And because of the whoredom, the immorality, is still a weird translation. King James? Okay, nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife. To avoid fornication. And let every woman have her own husband. Why? To avoid fornication. It is good not to have. Verse 1. What did they ask that he said that? Obviously, they were asking, is it better to avoid all the sexual problems and sins, just not to be married? And he says, yes, it is good. But to avoid fornication, to avoid porneia, to avoid immorality, let's have everybody has his wife, and every woman have her husband. Let the husband render unto the wife due benevolence. That means Yeah, you can check that for yourself. That means like let the husband not refuse sex to his wife, and likewise also the wife to the husband. If you're married, don't starve your partner to death sexually. Have sex. Don't let them be eaten by that appetite. The wife has no power over her own body but the husband, and likewise the husband has no power over his own body but the wife. He's making his point strong. Do not deny you to one another, except with consent for a time, that you may give yourself to fasting and prayer, and then come together again, that Satan may not tempt you for your incontinency. This is very clear language. Let's see another English translation over here. Easy to read version. Don't refuse to give your bodies to each other, but you might both agree to stay away from sex for a while so that you can give your time to prayer. They put the fasting away. Lukewarm translation. Then come together again so that Satan will not be able to tempt you in your weakness. This is clear language, guys. And then here he's going to start talking about divorce in a moment. I say this only to give you permission to be separated for a time. It is not a rule. So this is technically his advice. I wish everyone could be like me. That means, your Paul had no wife. But God has given each person a different ability. He makes them able to live one way, others to live a different way. Now for those who are not married, and for the widows, I say this. Now look at this. Speaking to not married people and widows. People that have no spouse. It is good for you to stay single like me. Okay, let's go back to the original meaning. Let's go back to the King James. Yeah, verse 8. King James. But if they can, let's go back. Sorry, let's go back to this one. But if you cannot control your body, then you should marry. Paul's solution for people with high sexual drive. If you can't control your sexual drive, better get married. It is better to marry than to burn with sexual desire. Now this is very plain language. The Bible has not been written for theologians, it's been written for normal people. So follow Paul's point. They are asking him, shall we just better not have a partner so to avoid all these sexual issues? And he says, yes, if you can, it's better to do that. But if you cannot, if your sexual drive is too high, get married. Don't deny sex to your husband. Don't deny sex to your wife, unless for a short time to pray and fast. But that's my personal advice. That's not a rule, he says. If you have this gift of God that you can stay, that you can live without sex, then better stay single. But if you don't, better get married and don't be consumed by sexual desire. That is until verse 9. Now, verse 10. Now I have a command for those who are married. Actually, it's not from me. It is what the Lord commanded. Who is the Lord? Here's not speaking about Jehovah God. He's speaking about Jesus. Of course, they are the same one, but he's quoting Jesus. A wife should not leave her husband. Now, this is a pagan society. Pagan societies, women could leave their husband, or the husband could send them away. Still the issue of the man being the one with the property, the owner of the house. In those societies, that was mainly the case. So it says, Jesus said that, do not leave your spouse. But if a wife does leave, okay, if that happens, she should remain single or get back together with her husband. And a husband, also the other way around, should not divorce his wife. Now look at that here. It's again speaking about the person taking the initiative. Now, for example, imagine here that a husband is beating up the kids and is a drug addict and is, jeopardizing the entire family and becomes unbearable. You don't have to divorce that man. You can leave him. But you're still one flesh with him. So don't touch anybody else and don't let anybody else touch you. Because you are still married to the man. Papers might say whatever they want, but you are one flesh with him. If you would remarry, you would commit adultery. But you can't leave him if the guy's going to kill your children or kill you. For example, if the wife, verse 11, does leave, she should remain single or get back together to her husband. In that case, husbands should not divorce their wives. Wives should not leave their husbands. The advice I have for the others is from me. This is his personal opinion. The Lord did not give us any teaching about this. Look at that. Jesus didn't give any teaching about this topic. He's speaking about here more cases of divorce. If you have a wife who is not a believer, you should not divorce her if she will continue to live with you. Now here, there has been a question asked, and you will see that later coming. If a marriage with an unbeliever became an unrecognized marriage in front of God's eyes, is it a marriage to the Lord if I'm married to a person who's not a believer? So if you have a wife who's not a believer, you should not divorce her if she will continue to live with you. So if she wants to continue, don't divorce. And if you have a husband who's not a believer, you should not divorce him if he will continue to live with you. The husband who is not a believer is set apart for God through his believing wife. It's not meaning that the husband is saved. It's meaning that God is considering that husband as part of a holy marriage because of the holy wife in it. And the wife who's not a believer is set apart, sanctified is in all the translations, for God through her believing husband. If this were not true, your children would be unfit for God's use. In all the translations they would be bastards. Let's see the King James. It's closer to the real text. Else your children would be unclean, but they are now holy. Why would he say that? Obviously because these people were thinking that being married to an unbeliever was not a Christian marriage, that God would not recognize it as a marriage, and they were separating or leaving or divorcing. But if the unbelieving part, verse 15, departs, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases. Now many will discuss is what is bondage. I believe this bondage means that you have no duty of staying married to this person if they want to leave. God has called us to peace. Now I will tell you why I think that. Because why do you know, oh wife, whether you will save your husband, or why do you know, man, whether you will save your wife? Of course, you know the Christian partner could eventually bring their unbelieving partner to salvation. But as God has distributed to every man, as the Lord has called everyone, so let him walk, and so ordain I in all churches. That the way you came, the way you came to salvation, you should stay that way. Is any man called being circumcised? Okay, this is let him not change it. Circumcision, let's say the way you are. Everybody abide in the same calling where you were, wherein he was called. Where you come, did you get saved being a servant? Don't worry about it. But if you can be free of it, try to be free of it. He explains those things just supporting the point of stay the way you were when you got saved. Brethren, let every man wherein he is called therein abide with God. Or with verse 24. Let's check this to read version. In your new life with God, each one should continue the way you were when God chose you. Now, look at this. I write about people who are not married. Okay, and this is tricky because the modern translations have changed this, and the King James has kept the real meaning. So let's be careful with this. I don't know if this translation is saying the right thing because this passage is key. People who are not married. I have no command from the Lord about this, meaning Jesus didn't teach anything about it, but I give my opinion and I can be trusted because the Lord has given me mercy. This is a time of trouble, so I think it is good for you to stay the way you are. You know, what he explained in the verses before. If you're married, stay married. If you're divorced, stay divorced. If you are a slave, stay slave. If you are this, stay like this. But if you have a wife, don't try to get free from her. Look, yeah, here they twist it. If you're not married, don't try to find a wife. The real meaning of this verse, let's go to the King James. I suppose, verse 26, therefore that this is good for the present distress, that it is good for a man so to be. Art thou bound unto a wife? The same term bound that was mentioned here before. Of that we are not bound to a person who wants to leave us because they are unbelievers. Bound unto a wife, seek not to be loosed, as the opposite of being bound. Seek not to be loosed, to stop the marriage. Art thou loosed from a wife? What is this? Being divorced. Then seek not a wife. Okay, so remarriage is a sin. Hold on. But, and if thou marry, thou hast not sinned. This is just his first advice always. If you don't have a partner and you can live without one, stay that way. But if you marry, you have not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. Why would it be a sin that a virgin marries? If she marries this person, a divorced one, a divorcee. Nevertheless, such shall have trouble in the flesh, but I spare you. Of course, remarriage is painful. Remarriage will be always trouble. You have been united to somebody for so long, broke that relationship, and yeah, sharing the paternity of the kids, competing with the jealousy and memories, and it's just a huge mess. Always is better to restore your first marriage. Always. But things happen, sins happens. What if you realize now that you did this wrong and you divorced wrong for wrong reasons, and you are now remarried or your ex-partner is remarried? If you have the chance to restore the relationship, do it. But if you are already married, or she or he is already married, don't divorce again, because that's an abomination. But this I say, brethren, the time is short. It remains that both they have wives be as they had none. Then he goes into another direction. He explains that, of course, being married makes you care for the things of the world and to please your husband or wife in place of only thinking of pleasing the Lord. So that is what the Bible teaches about marriage and remarriage. Now, what can we say further? Can we say then that remarriage is always good? Absolutely not. Can we say that divorce is always bad? Absolutely not. Every case is different, and we should be very wise and careful to advise people what to do with their lives. They should know, and you can check with their hearts where they are. If they are unrighteously remarried, they are married again now. And they did commit adultery when they joined to that woman or man, if it was unrighteously done. But it's not that every time they do it, they are committing adultery again, because they are not one flesh anymore with the first person, because now the first person, since they had now copulation, they had sex with another person, the victim of divorce, after that sex has been done, that's porneia, so they are free to remarry, which makes the guilty ones also free to remarry. But they have committed a sin nevertheless. Now people bring forth texts as Romans, in which Paul speaks in Romans 7, I think, in which Paul says, if a woman that has a husband sleeps with another one, shall be called an adulteress, but if the husband dies, she's free. And they say, you see, as long as your husband is alive, you're committing adultery. No. Romans is saying, let's check it, because the Bible is beautiful. It's all a single united message. But we need to keep our eyes honest and in context. Let's see here. The woman which, the law has dominion over a man as long as he lives. For the woman, let's go to this one. It's like what the law says about marriage. A woman must stay married to her husband as long as he is alive. Stay married to her husband. But if her husband dies, she is made free from the law of marriage. But if she marries another man while her husband is alive, the law says she's guilty of adultery. But if her husband dies, she's made free from the law of marriage. So if she marries another man after her husband dies, she's not guilty of adultery. Husband, not ex-husband. Of course, if you are in a working legal marriage, why would you marry somebody else? That would be adultery. But it doesn't mean that if your marriage was destroyed and your unbelieving husband decided to leave you, or he cheated on you, or whatever, for whatever reason your marriage stopped, that pact, commitment, or covenant, if you want to call it that way, though the Bible doesn't call marriage a covenant, but if you want to call it that way, whatever, that marital union was finished. So then you have no husband. If you have a husband, a real relationship, a nice or at least legal, still working, still ongoing marriage, and then you marry somebody else, then she's an adulteress. This is not speaking about divorced people. Jesus, when he spoke to the woman, the Samaritan woman at the well, he recognized she had 5 husbands, and that the last one was not a husband. He recognized those 5 as husbands. He didn't tell her to go back to the first one. He didn't say you had one husband and the 5 that you had afterwards were not your husbands. So it's very important, guys, to check these things in context and to be wise, because people can fool us, but they cannot fool God. People cannot say, yeah, a woman sends her husband to sleep in the attic or in another room and starves him to death, doesn't talk to him, she stops being a wife to him, and she's not giving to him his right as a husband. He's not earning it. Well, the Bible speaks about our role in our in relationships, not about the other person's roles in a relationship. If a woman is starving her husband to death in relationship-wise, or a man to a woman, and is not talking to her, not being caring to her, not being a husband to her, pushing the person into temptation, and then just waiting until he or she would fall in sin and say, you see, he or she cheated on me. Therefore, we cannot fool God. A man asked me lately, but I see a famous evangelist who committed adultery and divorced his wife and married his new girlfriend, and he's still preaching. Then can we say that he can just say, okay, God, I'm sorry? He can say that, but he's fooling God, or he's fooling himself, because God cannot be fooled. And of course, in the church world, people follow people. And if you are in the church of the great man of God, then you have to agree with everything he says. We don't follow anybody, we follow Jesus. So putting people to face their own consciences is much stronger than having rules of black and white. Restoration is always better. If we can stay without a husband and wife, it's better. If we can't, it's better to find a husband or wife. If we have been abandoned by our partners because of our faith, we are free to remarry. If we have unrighteously divorced, and that's the tricky one, and we come and we acknowledge later that what we did was wrong, we should at least repenting away from it. But the sad thing is that if we have committed sexual sins, it's sin against our own body, and we cannot undo it. If I lie, I can tell you the truth, confess my sin, and then restore what I did wrong. If I stole, I can pay back. If I hate, I can forgive. But if I had sex with somebody, I cannot undo that sin. So it's very, very bad, and it's important to be very careful with these things. But this is what I see in the Bible, in context, putting everything together. In the beginning, the law, Jesus and Paul. The 4 times the Bible deals with divorce and remarriage. So I hope this brings some light to you guys. Think about there's no possible black and white rule. We need to have the leading of the Holy Spirit in every case. Every case is different. And we need to put people in front of God's eyes and to let them pray and think about it and see what they did. But to re-divorce is also a sin. Well, this is my understanding about this topic. I hope you enjoy it and that this helps you, and that you can follow my line of what I meant. And God bless you guys. Thank you, and bye-bye.